20 years of experience as an international policy analyst, researcher, and practitioner, especially in the areas of Cambodia, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. Karen does not realize that by accepting to give this lecture, she has been trapped into expanding her international experience to India, and we are happy about it. And she has also graciously invited her fellow researchers from Sri Lanka to participate in today's webinar, expanding our center's reach to Sri Lanka with no effort on our part. We are indeed grateful to Karen. She is a founding international editor for the multilingual journal Disability and the Global South and has published extensively in the area. I am a novice in the area of disability studies and the Global South. My personal introduction to Karen has been through some of the key international anthologies that she has co-led. I have personal copies, I've read them also, of Disability and the Global South, The Critical Handbook 2016, The Global Politics of Impairment and Disability, Processes and Embodiments 2014. And my introduction to this rich area of disability studies in the Global South has been mediated by these books. I do intend to get Disability and Colonialism 2016, which is missing from my library very soon. And I eagerly await Karen's forthcoming book with Dinesha Samaratne, Women with Disabilities as Agents of Peace, Change and Rights, 2021. In the Critical Handbook, Karen has a chapter co-authored with Janak Bienvilla. The title of the chapter is Global Financialization and Disability. Can disability budgeting be an effective response in the South? I would like to read to you the last few lines in the introduction section of that chapter. Begin quote. By locating the 2008 financial crisis within neoliberal strategies of financial deregulation launched in the mid-90s, this chapter examines how the normalization of financialization mechanisms, processes, and practices reproduces the marginalization and exploitation of people with disabilities in the Global South. In particular, we illuminate new forms of colonialism by highlighting how global finance capital located in the Global North increasingly influences the development landscape. To conclude, we explore the increasing role of identity budgeting as first articulated in Sao Paulo through local feminist movements as gender budgeting as a counteracting Southern tool for social justice, end quote. The reason I read this few lines is to indicate the depth and width of domains of discourse that and timescales that intersect in understanding this innocent looking phrase, disability in the Global South. I'm delighted to let Karen take over from here to give her lecture. Thank you so much, Karen. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome.
Yes.
And I would also like to introduce my colleague, Niro Shini Kadasamy, who's you can see in the screen on the corner, who will be, we've been undertaking research together around the issues of technology and well, disability, gender in Sri Lanka under COVID. We've got a long-term project, and Niro's actively contributed to the new book that was just mentioned, that's actually been pre-released before 2021. So thank you, Doctor, for mentioning that. And that's now available from Routledge. So that's another one I hope you can add to your library. So yeah, it's great to have Niro online as well, and to be able to co-present the case studies later on. We have a tradition in Australia where we acknowledge the country that we're working from. So today I'm working on the lands of the Gadigal people in Sydney, which is the Indigenous First Nations name for the area that I actually live, and because of COVID, because we're all working from home, where I'm working from. And today, this week actually is a very special week for us. It's called Nadoc Week, and Nadoc Week really is the celebration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Indigenous culture in Australia and their struggle for survival with white settler colonisation. So thank you everyone for inviting me to this presentation. I have to say I am a little bit nervous, especially presenting via webinar, because it's very difficult to gauge the audience's engagement with the topic, and whether I'm putting you to sleep or you're getting up and making a cup of tea, and so I apologise in advance if so. So Doctor and I actually had a bit of a discussion about what I should present on. And one of the things that we talked about was, while I would be developing around the broader themes of global development, sustainability and Digitisation, and what that might mean for disability imaginaries in the Global South, which Nero and I will present case studies on later on, given the impact of COVID, which we all know has actually accelerated digitisation, and there's been a number of assumptions made with that acceleration of digitisation. But to actually to spend some time, given the name of the research centre, to spend some time thinking about what is the meaning of the Global South. So I guess what I'm going to do to give an overview of the main areas of today for the presentation, is I'm going to give some definitions of the Global South, some of its contestations, some of its rethinkings, some of the ideas, meanings and definitions. And I'm going to engage, I guess, more so in a dialogue rather than give a definitive opinion of what I think about what the Global South actually means when we refer to it in terms of discourse, what it means when we refer to it in terms of institutions or daily practices. Some of those things also about global narratives around the Global South, not just around the World Bank, but things like the Sustainable Development Goals, what they actually mean, and some of the limitations and strengths of those things, and some of the assumptions in moving forward around digitisation and automation in the Global South. And then I guess what Nero and I are going to do together, and Nero will really lead this component of the presentation, and that is to explore some of the case studies that we've been working with a number of women with disabilities who themselves are advocates and activists from different groups across the island of Sri Lanka. We've been working with these women, and they're featured in our forthcoming book. And we've been talking to them about the issues of digitisation and some of the assumptions that are made even in COVID lockdown, given that it's there's all of these able-bodied assumptions that are made that assumes that digitisation can actually result in inclusion for everyone. Okay, so I might just stop sharing my screen. And okay, so here we go. So I guess today's talk, what I wanted to really think about was three main questions. The first is, how is the Global South defined, or can we define it? What does the Global South mean? And kind of really, what kind of comes first? Is it its meaning, its definition, or does its definition, how we define it, is that what gives it meaning? So what is that interactive dynamic? And who should use the term the Global South, and how should it be used? So I guess, first of all, I think I really need to open up with the idea that the Global South is a highly contested term, yet it has really grown in its popularity as a term to define a particular part of the world, particularly with global academic research and within global policy institutes such as the World Bank and the UN. As a result, the Global South represents a range of meanings dependent on where, how, and who uses the term, and why it is being mobilised within discourse as a form of global representation. To begin, one thing we really need to be clear about is that it is more than a geographical description of the globe. As we can see from maps of the world that define what is the global north and the global south, often those maps might include Australia and New Zealand as part of a geographical space of the global south. But in actual fact, when it comes to wealth, power, particularly global political power, we know that Australia and New Zealand fit within the global north. And often from a geographical perspective, countries such as in Central Asia and Middle East might actually sit in the geographical boundaries of the north, but in terms of political and economic power, they actually remain within the global south. And then, as I'll discuss later, there is, this changing nature of the global political economy. And so the global south in and of itself is increasingly a flexible term about different shifting geopolitical struggles of power, political power, economic power, and military power. So the global south really is a political term that has been created to capture the ways the broader political economy operates as relationships between and across nation states. How these are embedded in long-standing power relations, often of colonisation, which have continued and continued in different shapes and forms, and the types of dependencies within the global political economy as a result of these long-standing historical relationships. This is in terms of economic development, issues of resource extraction and appropriation, and the impact upon the majority of the world's population. In fact, one contestation of the term the Global South by a particular group of scholars who argue that they actually take what they call a majoritarian perspective when describing these sets of broader structural, institutional, economic and cultural relations of power, usually embedded within the idea of the Global South, by stating that in fact it is the majority world, and therefore their preference is actually to use this notion of the majority world, because at a population level or empirically, this is what you would suggest is absolutely correct. The Global South incorporates by far the majority of the world's population. And even with a significantly emerging middle class within these nation states, they are by far significantly poorer, with less personal security and access to resources. Particularly, they might have income social mobility, but they don't necessarily have wealth distribution in the same way that we have within the global north. So therefore, the global south has multiple meanings and definitions, and it begs the question, how should it be used and who should use the term global south? So to answer this question, I also want to give some historical background to the term itself. So one thing we need to be clear about is that the term emerges at a time in the late 1960s, early 70s. And some have actually tracked it down to an area that it was actually developed in the global north by a group of eclectic political thinkers who came together across the divide of left and right politics in the late 1960s, early 70s. Who were examining ways to try and articulate a new global order against US imperialism and the kind of power that US imperialism was trying to maintain. Whether this is explicitly true, to be honest, I haven't done enough research to actually track the origins of the term in this way, but the readings that I have actually undertaken suggests that the term the Global South and the Global North actually emerges from the north rather than the south, which is kind of interesting because the term the global south in and of itself has become a term that is largely adopted by scholars in the South as a way to contest northern relationships of power, northern senses of value. In particular, what these group of scholars were trying to do was change this idea of valuation of former colonised economies articulated in contemporary political debates around the time of the Vietnam War. So in some type of way, what they were trying to do was to try and capture the ways in which new global political alliances were forming as an alternative to Cold War politics of the time, at the time, or this binary of imperialist capitalism and communist states. And we know in particular, India was quite a leader if we think about the non-alignment movement. So the non-alignment movement was a movement from the global South, but the language of the global South at the same time was emerging in the global North to try and articulate this political change. To articulate the ways in which nation states, particularly in former European economies, were attempting to, particular former European colonies, were attempting to undertake their own path of development so that they were no longer dependent upon the former colonisers to secure their economic development pathways. So whilst we had political independence within former colonial states, we didn't necessarily have economic independence. So part of the struggle of the non-alignment movement was actually to develop independent economic pathways that separated its economic dependence from their former colonisers, which many of you would know as dependency theories of development, or this idea of needing to disconnect from the former colonial powers. And also to one of the other main areas was to ideologically reposition the majority world in global political debates outside of this normative framing of the time that was particularly dominant in the 60s and 70s as developing economies and third world economies, which utilised an implicit framework of not just less power, but it's actually these ideas of third world and second world economies or developing economies as juxtaposed to a developed economy suggested that it was an economy, a country, a nation state of less value. Particularly if we think about the term third world economies, one of the reasons that's been argued extensively why the Global South has been adopted much more broadly is because it's the idea of aiming, it suggests this idea of national sovereignty between nation states of the same level of power, and that the institutions, the communities and the peoples within the Global South have their own value that is equal to and cannot be measured against or compared with that of the global North. So even though the global South as a definition always sits in this relationship to the global North, the idea of having this idea of the global South was to recognise these countries for their own value and the kinds of relationships that were being established, particularly in processes such as the non-alignment movement, which aim to form political blocs as distinct from that of US imperialism or former colonial powers. So the Global South, even though it emerges from a global North discourse in and of itself by a bunch of eclectic thinkers who come together to try and think about new ways of how we have a discourse to understand the global relations of power that were emerging as a result, particularly the result of the Vietnam War. What we know is that there's been a rapid adoption of this term, particularly since the 2000s, because it's increasingly adopted by scholars within the Global South to assert their own position of power in terms of democratic institutions, ideological positions, relationships between nation states, but also the changing broader political economic structures. And I guess one great example of that is BRICS. So, you know, the relationship between Brazil, Russia, India, and China, to try and capture these economies which really are no longer emerging markets. They really, as an integrated base, are able to assert their own positions of power within the global economy. So, and partly this really also emerges, as we know, from the collapse of the Cold War. What we see is radical reforms within the global economy, and we can no longer also have that kind of phraseology of a first world, a second world, and a third world. So some of these long-standing historical positions that had a level of validity during during last century no longer have that kind of validity anymore, because the global system of power has actually changed. And I mean, the global system of power, particularly since 2008, has changed so radically, even since Trump, even further. If we think about some of the kinds of, I guess, disruption that he's tried to create in the global South because of the emerging political economic power of the global South within the global North. Some scholars even argue that Wallerstein's world systems theory, where we think about, you know, where is the center of power lie and where is, you know, so the metropole and who sits at the peripheral, has radically changed as well. So I think we need to think about the global South as really a really dynamic and changing definition, something that can't be captured simply, but it is really trying to contest this idea of the dominance of the global North as maintaining power. And I mean, really, there are some, but if we think about coming out of the Second World War, if we think about the Bretton Woods institutions that established these global institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN and so forth, you know, these, since this time, this particularly the end of the Cold War and then coming into the 2000s, this, you know, there has been significant changes to the political economy, and that's placed a number of tensions on these, what were historically normative structures of power that maintained this idea of a global North and a global South, and that has radically changed. I guess this kind of comes to my other question, my third question, which is, do I think we should use it as a term, given that it's constantly undergoing these kind of stresses and pulls, and what sits within the global South is radically changing all the time, particularly if we think about that the global South is not just thinking about a geographical space or one dimension of political power, but, you know, there are multiple dimensions of power here. And that's not just political power, but we're thinking of economic power, cultural power, representative power, even, and, you know, these can be measured from multiple empirical kind of lines of inquiry. Before I want to go on and argue, you know, why it's generally accepted and why and how I use it, I do want to refer to Thomas Hyland Erickson's work of 2015, who has a number of, I guess, contestations, queries, suggests a number of limitations, and some of these I agree with. And that is, I mean, the first thing he says is, you know, we should be a little bit skeptical of a term that rapidly becomes fashionable, such as the Global South, and which it has. And, you know, I'm just as guilty of promoting this idea of the Global South. And the reason why I'm guilty of it is because I do think it has political import. And as someone who's lived in the Global South for extensive periods during the 90s and spent extensive time there during the 2000s, it was a term taught to me by people who were from the Global South. So that's one of the things I will discuss later, is who's using this language and why are they using it. One of the key issues about the Global South, and I think it's particularly true around disability, is it doesn't, if we say the Global South, it has, one of the problems is that it risks homogenizing countries as a set of equal power relationships between those different nation states and within those nation states. So that is a limitation in and of itself of the idea of the Global South. And so we need to think about, I guess, you know, that when we do research or when we're thinking about engaging or testing out technologies and we're thinking about the Global South, we need to be very mindful and conscious that there are hierarchies within the Global South in and of itself. And some of these are long-standing and historical, some of these were brought in by colonisers, and some of these have emerged as the power relationships have begun to change, particularly with the start of independence in the 40s and 50s, and then the way the political struggles for power and equality and representation has changed in the Global South itself. One of the other issues, which I think is also a problem with the structure of the whole narrative around decolonisation, is this idea is that it's grounded in this idea of a methodological nationalism. So, and, you know, nationalism or the idea of the nation state is in of itself a Western invention. And we know this whole idea of borders, particularly within the Global South, is something that's always under contestation. In your own region up north, there's constant discussion and debate about, you know, what are the borders and boundaries. So this idea that the Global South consists of finite nations that are corralled in particular borders, you know, comes into question. And I mean, we can just think of Sudan, where, you know, the borders have recently changed. So, you know, it's grounded in a particular form of methodological nationalism. Some argue that one of the issues with the Global South is it is a term that it works for the elite because of its process of homogenizing across the nation, rather than looking deeper at the kinds of hierarchies that emerge, particularly post 68, with changes in global political economies and the kinds of internal inequalities and insecurities that emerge, and the kinds of inequalities and insecurities that emerge in the later 1990s, so post the Cold War, and then again in the 2000s. The other issue too is, you know, one of the things that has happened in the Global South, you know, its initial intent, I guess, understanding that its initial intent was really about trying to define this relationship of economic independence of former colonized countries from their colonizer by setting up different economic relations, such as the model of the Third World Non-Alignment Movement, which which they were trying to do. But actually what's happened increasingly is that we know that under this model of global north, global south, particularly the way that the World Bank and the IMF use this notion of the global north and the global south, that actually countries in the global south are seen as emerging markets, and therefore are promoting a global north definition of what capitalist development is, with the neoliberalisation of the global economy. So, you know, its origin of trying to establish a counter narrative or an alternative narrative to the dominance of a particular economic structure that was grounded in a form of, some people argue US imperialism, other people argue a form of Western political liberalism because of the idea of the individual. So, you know, increasingly what it represents at the geopolitical or and the political economic is actually an integration of the South into these northern frameworks. So Erickson asked the question, is it really an idea of contestation in terms of its original framework, or has it moved and shifted since then? And I guess the other thing is that one of the critiques is, because of this ongoing focus on the political economic level, it actually misses out on the richness of differentiation, diversity, or within different nation states itself, and relationships across borders and boundaries around the cultural symbolic realm. So how people imagine belonging to community and the kinds of rich cultural practices that emerge on the ground at that local level. And, you know, if we don't incorporate that into a narrative around what is the global South, where we're only focusing on economic inequality, you know, what we could lead to are processes of population decimation or dispossession in trying to forge this path of rapid development. And so the other issue, I guess, is Erickson doesn't really highlight this, but it's one thing that I would suggest living in a country such as Australia. And that is, you know, one of the problems with this, with the dominance of this idea of the global South and the global North in terms of its methodological nationalism, it really misses out on white settler colonial societies such as Australia, where we know, according to UNDESA, so the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, that Indigenous Australians or First Nations Australians, you know, have in some parts of Australia, have a significantly lower levels of lifespan. You know, they have higher levels of disability. I mean, it's almost twice the rate of non-Indigenous Australians of disability. They have, you know, they sit in the lowest quintiles of income inequality. So one of the things when we think about the global South, is it really just about, and this is the problem with its methodological nationalism, is it really about the boundaries of particular nation states and the kind of geopolitics that situates these nation states in global relations of power? Or is it much more broader than this, to think about where different hierarchies of peoples and communities actually are situated within this situation? And that's where Dr. Manaha actually, one of the things he said, we'd be really interested in some of your Indigenous research. And I haven't done Indigenous research within the Global South, but I do a lot of Indigenous research with people in Australia and Canada. And one of the reasons, you know, as someone who's spent extensive periods of time in the Global South, you know, there are many instances where I would definitely say, in terms of there are instances in white settler colonial societies where poverty, inequality, so some of the markers that we suggest for the Global South are far more entrenched in terms of inequality within Indigenous Australia. Okay, I just realised I'm going on for a long time. Sorry about that. So one of the things is I use the term the Global South, and I actually use it from De Sousa Santos's work coming out of 2008. And De Sousa Santos is a legal scholar, and I particularly like his work called Another Knowledge is Possible, because I think what he does is he creates an opportunity to think about the richness and diversity, or the ecology of knowledges that exist beyond this dominance of the Western academy within the North. So, you know, what he actually argues is Southern knowledges. We're not just talking about, you know, this geopolitical or political economy or these relationships of inequality. What we're thinking about is ways of being, ways of doing, and ways of knowing in the world that are substantially different between that within the Global South, often are highly localised and situated, to the dominance of the Global North that is dominated by this kind of political liberalism of individualism and individual competitivism, increasingly under neoliberalism. So practices of embodiment and engaging in the world are locally grounded, and locally grounded in relationships of power. So we need to think more broadly about individuals in their embodied context of everyday life and how they understand and ascribe meaning to that. And that is a Southern knowledge, far more of political import rather than adopting practices of Western political liberalism that frames, I guess, what we would say in Australia with Indigenous scholars is of what we would call a form of epistemic racism or epistemic violence that tries to shut out other ways of knowing or understanding. So this is where I think this centre is really kind of exciting, because what it's trying to do is understand different ways of engaging with technology as a form of everyday practice. What I'm going to do is quickly just say that one of the things in working with Indigenous people in Australia is one of the things that I have begun to really take on this idea that, you know, part of Southern knowledge is not about coming in as the expert and the all-knower, but understanding and accepting and listening. So in Australia, in Indigenous politics, there's a particular narrative that we call the politics of deep listening, and that is listening to how others describe themselves, how others understand their engagement in the world, and we use those forms of self-identification as Southern knowledges, rather than trying to box it into Western epistemologies or ways of knowing and being. So, so when we work in collaboration with other peoples and other communities, how do they self-describe, and then how do we articulate that and their expression of who they are and how they understand and engage in the world. And I guess for Nero and I, that's been particularly important with this work that we've been doing in Sri Lanka, and our long-standing work, which is our recent book that Dr. Manohar just mentioned at the beginning, that will be coming out. That's actually out now in hard copy. It's got 2021 on it, but it's actually recently been released. So that's been particularly important, and using the idea of and using the tools of narrative and in-depth narrative, so people can actually engage in their own story, to tell us, to show us how to understand. And the other one that I've been using a lot in Australia with digital tools is this idea of ethnographic mobilities, where people engage in practices of self-documentation. So they're actually documenting their own story and being their own observers to produce knowledge for the world. So what does that mean in terms of disability and disability processes? And Nero, shall we talk a little bit about now getting onto our case studies in Sri Lanka and talk a little bit about that? Is that?
So we've been, as Karen has just said, doing research work and advocacy work with Sinhalese, Tamil and Muslim women in Sri Lanka, in post-conflict Sri Lanka, for quite some years now. And basically what we've been trying to do is understand their lived experiences. And one of the first things that really struck us was the kinds of deeply intersectional experiences that these women are kind of implicated in a lot of ways, that really affect how they live their everyday lives. And so we find that there are clear differences, while there are clear differences between Tamil, Sinhalese and Muslim women, they also share similarities in terms of the ableist discourses that they need to navigate, to just, everything from accessing welfare benefits from the government to dealing with social stigma in their communities. And in sort of the recent months, we've continued our research with them to try and understand how COVID has affected their lives. And it's been really, it's been hugely, I think, revealing for us to see how deeply COVID has kind of really impacted their survival in a lot of ways. These women find themselves in really precarious situations, much more so than the general population. So I think maybe what we might do, Karen, is to just maybe highlight some of the experiences of the women. So I might begin with a woman that we interviewed called Nisha. Nisha is a Muslim woman who lives with an impairment in her leg. And Nisha is an advocate, a disability advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities. And she's quite vocal in her community. She owns a watch repair business in Kandy, which is quite an important and religious historic site in Sri Lanka. And she uses her watch repair shop to financially support herself. And she's, being quite active in her local community. And COVID has really transformed her life in so many different ways. She's had to close her business, which means she's been living at home and has really kind of struggled to have income. And she tells us how, because of the fact that she doesn't have income at the moment, and with curfews, she's faced numerous obstacles regarding her safety, her economic viability in the future. She's not quite sure where her life is really heading at the moment. And she also raises some really crucial points about the experiences that women with disabilities face in terms of, for example, even going to the shops when they are open for those limited hours and not being able to feel safe, and finding that, you know, the hygiene or, you know, is not up to standard, and the fact that the roads are not safe for her to be traveling on by herself. And she finds that because of the limited hours that she can be outside, it's really restricting her mobility. And so she relies quite heavily on her family to support her, which wouldn't be the case outside of this, outside of COVID. Another example is a Tamil woman who we interviewed who lives in a remote area. And this woman experiences, again, a severe lack of kind of access to basic supports that have intensified during the COVID period. And this is due to the fact that she does, you know, she lives in a rural area, and so she's unable to travel at kind of, you know, the times that she would be able to if there wasn't COVID, but also the fact that she's unable to access government supports again as well. And, you know, we really kind of started to see that these themes were quite common across these women that we interviewed. And so one thing that was really quite similar across their experiences was this question about access to technology and the role of technology in their everyday lives. And so one thing that's happened in Sri Lanka as elsewhere is the kind of transfer of information to online platforms. And so the Sri Lankan government, like a lot of other governments, has been communicating information about COVID restrictions, for example, in public health messages on social media and government websites, and so on. And so what we've really found are kind of two main issues related to technology in the lives of these women with disabilities. And the first one relates to access to technology, and the second one relates to actually navigating online systems. So, I mean, just quickly on the first point, for some of these women who live in rural areas, there's really very little opportunity for them or their families to have access to technology, and it's quite stark between their experiences and the experiences of people who live in urban areas like Colombo or even Jaffna town, for example. The impacts are quite profound for these women. This one particular woman is, she's a young Tamil woman with multiple disabilities and was in the final stages of completing her bachelor's degree, and she's aspiring to be a teacher. But more immediately, the reality is that for women like her, not having access to technology puts her out of reach for receiving just basic welfare assistance. I mean, so the fact that she doesn't have adequate or really any access to technology was quite telling about the kind of multiplicity and kind of the intersectional challenges that face women like her who live in rural areas. And just quickly, the second issue was related to the impacts of, even when people did have access to technology, there were really next to no supports available to them to develop their digital literacy skills. So the women that we interviewed had difficulties reaching out to government officials, and in the sense that their mobile phones were often unresponsive. There were difficulties in receiving the allocated aid, and that was due to not being able to navigate government websites. And this was especially the case for people, for them, with their various impairments. And they did sort of raise additional points about other people with disabilities who had, for example, visual and hearing impairments who couldn't really kind of navigate, these public health messages and websites to get access to government assistance. So really, when we talk about, I think, technology and the lived experiences of people with disabilities, it's important to think about their experiences in intersectional terms, because for the women that we interviewed, they navigate not only sort of challenges that emerge from their gender, but also their race and their class, their rurality, and so on. So they're probably the bits that I'd want to emphasize.
And some of that is really about I mean, the thing is, you know, we often think of the digital space, particularly around platforms, devices, and we think about digitisation from that angle at the individual level, but there's also the broader infrastructure levels. And I guess this is one thing that we know that is quite significantly different between the global north and the global south, is that often in countries such as Sri Lanka that's had long-standing conflict, what it means is that the infrastructure that is necessary to provide the appropriate level of digital engagement on par is not. The infrastructure is not there. The state hasn't invested that infrastructure. Part of that is about the history of colonisation, and then the journey from there. And part of it too is with neoliberalisation, you know, is the ongoing privatisation of public infrastructure, and therefore, you know, public infrastructure is only developed so far to so many regions where it's actually profitable, unless there's kind of a service agreement between the state and capital as part of that investment. So so there are some historical differences that emerge in the global south, particularly around broader structures of infrastructure that we need to think about in terms of digitisation and automation. And in Sri Lanka under COVID, it's one thing that we, you know, there were the issues of class in terms of people, you know, unable to have actually the kinds of devices that enable digital engagement with government welfare platforms and so forth. And, you know, that's because A, the expensive devices are unaffordable. B, there's also the relationships of power where people are used to being, so someone like Nisha, she's used to actually being independent, and the reason why she has her own business is so she can actually be independent. But because of social protection regimes under within a country like Sri Lanka, typical of the global south, when we think about social protection in and of itself and the kinds of inequalities that exist in social protection regimes, it means that she has to become dependent on her family, where in Australia, you know, there was extensive investment in COVID to support. So there was this one quite significant difference between the global north and the global south, where significant investment to keep people independent through supplying, ensuring extra hours for carers and so forth. Where in the global south, states aren't necessarily making those kind of investments to enable people to continue their levels of independence during these particular crisis situations. But the states make assumptions around digitisation and disability, not just in terms of literacy, but also in terms of equal kind of power relationships within the household that would give disabled people voice and agency at home to be able to ascertain, even if the infrastructure's there. So, you know, someone like Nisha, even though the infrastructure in Kandy might be there, she's still reliant on her family members to navigate the digital interfaces. And that in and of itself, you know, creates a number of vulnerabilities and potential abuses of power that she wouldn't be exposed to if she didn't have to rely on a digital interface. Nero? So
I would agree. I think, yeah, I would agree with you, Karen. I think what's really emerged from our fieldwork in Sri Lanka is that the role of family and society is so critical, even if technology is available to people. I mean, as I said, one issue is being able to navigate those systems, but secondly, what's more important or equally important is having that support, having support from family and society to be able to kind of really kind of, I guess, you know, be the foundational basis for you navigating the everyday world. Because, I mean, the technology is there and important, but it's only as effective as a society and the governmental structures in place that are going to give you access to welfare, employment and education and so on. So it needs to, I think the development has to happen simultaneously. And what we found, especially with women who live in rural areas, is, you know, they face, you know, a multitude of problems, and to be able to address them, I think we need to consider, as I said, their intersectional experiences. So technology, you know, having access to food, to education, to employment, all has to happen in a much more integrated fashion.
And we also found in the rural areas that you might, you know, even if you have access to technology, because of the development of roads, times of delivery, the availability of food within rural areas, you know, you might be able to order something online, but or you might have the possibility of digital engagement to get services and goods delivered, but, you know, they might not actually be able to come for periods of time due to other forms of infrastructure and environment that navigate that. So technology really has to be, I guess, you know, often we focus on things like the smartphone, how do we make that accessible, different forms of engagement, but we need to think about technology, I guess, as an integrated platform to our other areas of life to ensure that it's fully accessible and affordable and adaptable for people with disabilities, particularly in the Global South, where there are different types of challenges that might emerge. I think overall, one thing that we need to think about is that, you know, when we think about accessibility, we need to think about accessibility much more than technological literacy and know-how, and immediate devices and platforms. But we need to think about the relationships of power that the person is embedded, and how much agency, autonomy and control they actually have over their technology. So that's one of the things that we found with the women in Sri Lanka that we interviewed during COVID, is that, you know, it's not just access to that technology, but, you know, how much autonomy and control and agency do they have over that technology, so they're able to maintain their own well-being. So, you know, other issues of privacy, how do they, you know, how do people with disabilities maintain, you know, it's not just, it's the three of them: autonomy, agency and privacy. Particularly when we know women with disabilities in particular are often of a lower class or caste, and therefore don't necessarily have access to independent resources, are reliant on family members. So, you know, we'll have structural patriarchal relationships of power, and also assumptions around women and their sexuality and so forth, and the kinds of vulnerabilities that might mean for a woman with disabilities, and therefore, you know, her not actually having access to these different types of technologies. But also too, we need to think about, I guess, the broader structures, or what we call critical infrastructures in the cultural humanities, where we think about, you know, what kinds of social infrastructures actually exist to enable, you know, these kind of digital interventions that will generate individual or, you know, social group autonomy and agency. And when they're not there, what kinds of things fall in to fill that vacuum, and what kind of issues does that mean are created where they don't have access to those same resources on par? Okay, I think we're done.
I request, oh, there's a question already, but I request people to type in your questions on chat, and I will take them through in the order we get. But first of all, thanks a lot, Karen. I think especially to spending the time on Global South, it's been very, very interactive. And so let me get on with the questions.
Thank you.
I'll come back to that a lot more when we have time. Okay. With a question from Amit, with a greater need to listen into the self-description of Indigenous social groups as part of attending to aspects concerning the Global South, do you feel technology design also needs a new approach? For example, something that can be driven much more by these Indigenous voices, the autonomy that you referred to perhaps, than a more homogeneous development process with claims of global reach and efficiency, which may be far removed from these lived experiences. So the basic question is, do you feel technology design needs a new approach?
For example, something can be driven much more by Indigenous. So, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because I think there is the issue of co-design. So, I'm currently working on a project in Australia with we're comparing two areas around class, around different kinds of ethnic and religious backgrounds, and access to technology. And what is really interesting in this project is they take their technologies and they adapt and they change them and they manipulate them, and it's kind of this form of hacking that we've never ever seen really, to meet both their disability needs and their socio-cultural linguistic needs. And so they're doing that all at once. And their preference is if they had the opportunity to start in the space of co-design. In terms of, so for people with disabilities, particularly from people with disabilities who are outside the mainstream with all their other markers of distinction, co-design really is the way that they would prefer to go. And one of the reasons for that is once you start, you know, one of the things that we find, particularly in the Indigenous or in Australia, what we call the cultural and ethnically diverse space, is that because, you know, non-white bodies or in a white society are already marked by attitudes against them in terms of racism and so forth, a lot of the time they don't want to claim disability. So if they can have a mainstream technology that they can hack and amend, so people don't know that they have a disability, they much prefer to do that than actually have some kind of technology that's specifically designed for them, because they don't want to, within their own community where they belong, they don't want to highlight that they might be different in some way. And then when they get into the white community to navigate everyday life, going to work, public transport, whatever it is, because they already have a marker of difference, they also don't want to add another, which might increase, you know, them to forms of violence or abuse and so forth when on the street. So we increasingly find in this project that if mainstream devices, platforms, technologies can be designed in a way that can be hacked, so people can hack into them for their own personal use, they'd be much more taken up by people with disabilities.
Karen, can you read the question there on the chat?
Yep. So thanks a lot. I'd like to ask, why do you think psychosocial is invisibilised among the disability discourse, has found a place? That's really good. So why has psychosocial disability is invisibilised? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure that it's invisibilised. It might be invisibilised in terms of disability language, but I think psychosocial disability is highly visibilised in health discourse around mental health language. So around, and I think it's the one area that as a group of people with disabilities has really kind of the medical fraternity has been able to hold on to its power in terms of labelling psychosocial disability as a mental health issue, where other disability groups have been able to harness the social model and the rights-based model of disability to create really a new discourse. But the psychosocial group, I mean, we call them psychosocial, but really if you think about government frameworks, if you think about the WHO, you know, everyone's going on about a global mental health crisis. And that's really a health-based agenda, not a disability rights agenda. And so I think yes, it is invisibilised within disability discourse, but I think in terms of medical health discourse, psychosocial is hyper-visibilised around this medicalisation of mental health. And yeah, so I think we need to unpack that in terms of who's got the power in defining this term. It's a bit like the term, how I try to think about the Global South. It's that similar idea of who's got the power, who's talking about it, and what kind of meaning are they trying to ascribe to it by classifying it as a mental health rather than psychosocial disability.
Thank you. I think that's precise. Anyone has a question? I have one. I think I'm referring to Nero. Thanks a lot for your presentation of your field work. We will work more and hear from you more. So you mentioned an interesting point about, in spite of technology being there, family and neighbors are the best support that people with disabilities get, especially in the Global South. In view of this, is it a possibility to think about technology, designing technology for interdependence rather than independence, maybe more relevant to the Global South, given the lack of infrastructure, government support, the ability to access the support? What are your thoughts on it? Either you, Nero, or Karen, or both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the point, which maybe I should have made clearer, is, you know, the kind of multiple problems that, or challenges that these women face kind of makes us wonder how, or whether it's possible to have technology being developed alongside, you know, family supports, societal supports, government supports, infrastructure, so all the things that Karen was talking about. So is it possible to think about technology as not a separate thing, but as being a part of, you know, all of the other changes that need to take place for that technology to be successful and effective? So is it possible that we can think about technology in a way that would also, you know, perhaps help the way society thinks about women with disabilities? Is it possible to think about technology in ways that might help young people with disabilities have better access to education? So I think the thinking has to happen simultaneously. It's not, for me, from the work that we've done in Sri Lanka, it appears that, technology is one part, but is it possible to think about it as being more integrated into other aspects of their lives, because they do face multiple challenges, due to their race, due to their class, due to their gender, and so on. So yeah, it's I guess the possibilities of technology in kind of everyday lives. Yeah.
So I think there is a follow-up almost question from Raji. Can you read the chat? Just for you, actually. This kind of fits into this current question.
Yeah. Yeah, so very little has been done.
Sorry, Nira, I'll just read it for those who may not be able to read. The question is from Raji.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned basically two issues: access to technology and navigation of technology, especially by PWDs. So what action has happened to resolve these issues, in particular by the government? What about the education of PWDs? I'm interested in understanding the measures taken by the government. Thank you.
Yeah, so when we did the interviews for this preliminary research, it was in May, at the kind of, really the restrictions were really intensifying in Sri Lanka. And at that point of doing the interviews, we really didn't see much improvements in the access that these people had to supports from the government. We haven't done any follow-up interviews with those people, but our understanding of the situation there is that there appears to be an increase in the number of COVID cases, and the government has returned to its harsh COVID restrictions. So I think, from looking at what the government's been doing since May, it doesn't appear that much has changed, and I can't imagine that much has changed in terms of the experiences of people with disabilities. So I think it would be quite useful if, for us to interview these people again, to do that kind of ethnographic research that's required to see what's changed over time, and how people perhaps have also found ways to overcome the limitations, or found ways to navigate government structures that are in place, or measures in place. Karen, would you like to add to that?
I think Nero's last point about how people overcome. I mean, one thing, I know it's very different in certain places, and Sri Lanka is a very different, in some ways, I guess because of its size and its population base. But one thing we have found is, and it could be because we're often working with women who, as part of the project, become advocates, or they want to, they have an interest in becoming an advocate, and that's why they're contacting us. But I guess the thing that we find is that, that they have incredible skills in trying to overcome the barriers that are put up before them, and that even things like if they don't feel they can trust family members, they work out other ways to get access to the resources that they need. I don't think that's for a lot of the women that we, a lot of women with disabilities, but in the case, because we are working with women who have actively taken up an identity as a disability advocate, it's something that we find that they're very creative in trying to transform the limitations imposed upon them with the limitations around infrastructure, affordability, accessibility, and so forth. So I think I think we do need to do more research, particularly given that there's a second lockdown. But they do seem to, the women that we have been working with over a number of years, as we document in the book, really really engage in activation processes to not just survive, but to thrive in with all of the limitations placed upon them.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
Incidentally, the question.
I mean, one thing that, sorry, just adding to that, one thing that emerged was the kind of resilience and resistance to the limitations that these women were demonstrating. So, you know, we did find that as a result of these government restrictions, women were starting to find ways of organizing. And I think that's an area of research that definitely needs more attention.
So I think we will have one last question from Anup. This is an amazing talk with great insights from the grassroots level. My question, are there any social support groups, particularly on disability, within the Indigenous community that are working in adaptation of mainstream technology?
I'm happy to answer that one. So Indigenous community in Australia, I'm assuming you're talking about there. The Indigenous community are really interesting in how they use technology. So one thing is, first of all, so, you know, everyone talks about drones and drones being a highly militarized device. Well, what Indigenous communities in Australia, particularly in rural and remote areas, have started to use drones as ways to map land around what they call Indigenous country. So they can make claims for that particular area of land. In that, the way that they use phones, the way that they use different apps, there's quite a number of communities in what we call the outback or the bush that are utilising mainstream technologies in a ways that they can communicate with each other to sustain well-being. There is issues around, there are concerns around too much internet access being a distraction for younger people. But in terms of Indigenous communities, so then one of the NGOs that I work with and do research with is the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence. Excuse me, and they have a whole program around developing technology and adapting technology interfaces with rural and remote Indigenous kids, including kids with disabilities and learning disabilities, to enable them to engage in education and so forth. So yes, there's lots and lots going on.
Okay, I think we would love to continue, but I think is a time to close. Even very good things. So I would like to thank both Karen and Niro for sharing their work, and been extremely enlightening for me personally, especially the discourse on the global south and the contentions around the use of the phrase why, where, and how, and by whom has been very useful. At the beginning, I was beginning to wonder, maybe we rush to name the center as a center for accessibility in the global south. But I think at the end of the completion of the discourse, I'm convinced that being in India, which itself is such a heterogeneous population everywhere you look, we have a lot to learn and to contribute to the general area of disability in the global south.
Yeah.
So I thank you especially for this lecture and look forward to working with Karen and Niro as we go forward. On behalf of everyone at the center and everyone in the audience, very, very, a lot of thanks to you, and I appreciate your time and your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you
Over
for
to
having
you.
us.
You're welcome. Over to you, Amit.
Thank you. And happy to talk more about the Global South, but I personally think it's the right name.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Niro, for
you.
that wonderful talk. Thank you, Dr. Manohar. It was actually, as Dr. Manohar summed up, the entire your discussion around the and the narratives and the methodologies that we need to adopt going forward, or when we're looking at these kinds of things, provides a lot of meat for us to look at, engage with in this center. And I think that's what we are trying to do to a certain extent. We are trying to listen in to all these different voices and see how is it that we can bring in more and more voices into the discourse, maybe question uh, the ones that exist, and see how we can coexist uh, in terms of our approaches to understanding issues, our approaches to moving ahead, and our approaches to moving ahead with possibly the best ways of designing technologies. And I think towards that, it was wonderful to have you, Karen, and have Nero with you for this talk. Thank you very much for agreeing. And we look forward to a sustained collaboration. So this is not a one-off. So this is the beginning, and we will keep on, say, talking with you, taking guidance, collaborating, all that is what we intend to do as we go forward.
Sounds great. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and thank you. All these talks, all these discussions, we are trying to archive. We are trying to build upon all these discussions to see how we can contribute to the agenda, contribute to the discourse through various mechanisms. The first one that we are looking for is developing courses, developing short-term, long-term courses and program modules, which can add to the scholarship, which can add to the training of, say, people who want to work on accessibility, who want to work on assistive technologies, etc. So towards that, our next, we don't have a, or our next webinars are subsumed within a winter school that we are planning to hold in the first week of January, and we'll announce it in a couple of weeks. And the winter school will bring together about 8 to 10 sessions devoted to various aspects of accessibility in the global south. So we'll be looking at, say, some aspects that you mentioned, Karen, in your talk. We'll also be looking at assistive technologies. We'll be looking at law and policy. We also intend to look at, say, the methodologies that you talked about. How can we listen better? How can we ensure that technology designs are amenable to hacking, as you called, at the local level? Yeah, so these are some of the sessions that we feel would be useful for this winter school. Is a slightly longish. So from these 1.5 hour webinars, we are trying to do a 10-hour winter school. And from there on, we are also looking at full-fledged, say, 3 credit, 4 credit semester long courses going forward, exchanging ideas with universities and research organizations across the world on matters related to accessibility in the global south. So thank you, Karen, thank you, Nero, thank you, Dr. Manohar, thank you everyone who attended today's webinar. We all will keep in touch. We'll keep you informed of future activities of our center, and we'll keep coming back to you for more insights and more ways of collaborating together.
Thanks to our interpreters for the day. I think they have been very busily at work, because I think I've been speaking very fast, and so they've been keeping up. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It was wonderful to be able to participate. Thank you. It's excellent initiative. It's really exciting.
Glad to have you, and glad you like the name as well. So we will.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye, Nero. We will be in touch with you.
Bye.
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 Thanks. Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Manisha. Thank you, Surbi.
Manisha and Shruvi. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I keep forgetting the names. Apologies. As I say, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you, Amit. Wonderfully done. Thank you, Supriya.
Thank you, sir.
And
Thank you.
Aditi is around. Yeah, she must be
She's
the last person.
Arati.
Yeah,
Arati.
Arati, sorry, Arati. Again, I keep changing names. Arati, you must be the last person to leave any case. So thank you, Arati. We will catch up. Thank you. Bye bye.